If you need to make new work for your portfolio, or you struggle with doing so, or you're not even sure what to make, this video is for you. What's up? This is MVA Joshua. For about the next 40 minutes, we're going to talk portfolios and how to leverage your existing portfolio to make new work. We're going to talk about what gets in the way of making work when you're outside of school and why it's sometimes so hard to make new portfolio pieces. And the last bit is from a workshop where I met one-on-one with people and we talked about what they wanted to do and what was missing in their portfolio and how to get the things that were missing from work that they had already done. I hope that you enjoy this. This is the first of 2 videos that have these one-on-one sessions, and I think they're really valuable. So even if you're just struggling with like what it is that you want to do with design, it's probably worth a watch. Thanks a lot. So it's a little bit before 5, it's about 4:45. I get out just a tiny bit early so that I can get some dinner and a nice coffee before I go teach the portfolio expansion workshop tonight. And I think I got back all the survey questionnaires that I sent out to people. And you don't know this, but I was a little disappointed by the kind of drop off in people who took the other two workshops and then didn't take this one. Maybe they thought it was a little bit too entry level or something like that. And having seen the answers to the questionnaires now and knowing that there's a higher ratio of people who had wild card kind of answers than I thought, and they're not really wild card, it's just their portfolios almost barely qualify as portfolios in terms of numbers, that this opens up more time to talk to individual circumstances. So it's kind of like the workshop can still do what it was intended to do, but then there's more of a chance to talk about some stuff that's not the express purpose of it, but that should be of value to people attending. So that's kind of cool. And what I'm going to do right now is, while I go and get my Chipotle and my iced coffee, I'm going to go for one more time and run through the opening part of this, which is to kind of talk about why do people have trouble developing new work for their portfolio. Before we get into the main chunk of this, which is to talk about this idea of leveraging the current work to improve your portfolio without redesigning it, mind you, I want to talk about why is it so hard to make new portfolio work independently, meaning outside of classes and outside of freelance or even trades and stuff like that. What is it that makes that so difficult? It's kind of easy to make work, like if you don't have this expectation. But when you're making something and you're expressly saying, this thing is for my portfolio, you're basically saying, this piece of work has a job to solve. Even if you're a designer, it's not solving the job that the work usually has to solve, right? Like, it's got to make someone aware of something or promote something or communicate something. Instead, it's like, it has to do that as an abstraction. But ultimately, what it has to do is become this thing that says, I am the right person for this job or this brand or this type of work. It introduces like a lot of levels of complexity because when it creates pressure. And there's a certain insinuation that it's stuff you might not make automatically on your own because maybe you would choose to do something more fun. So these are kind of 4 ways that I think people get stuck on the stuff they're trying to make. So the first one that I kind of find everybody comes up against is the timelines aren't real. And because of that, you end up blowing these timelines and then you start to wonder like, okay, I want to do this thing. I know I need to do this thing, but then why am I not doing it? So you set a timeline up, and then you start blowing that timeline. What's the timeline or the deadline supposed to do, if it's real, is scare you. One, it makes sure the project lives and sees the light of day in the way it's supposed to, but it's also supposed to scare you. Like, it's a way of providing accountability. But the problem is, if the project is purely for your portfolio, that deadline can't possibly scare you. Like, you would have to do so much work to freak yourself out and to get leverage over yourself to make that deadline real, that it fails in what it's supposed to do. Like, it fails in creating accountability, and it kind of just becomes another thing to feel bad about. Kind of along with that is a lot of people almost can't work without feedback. Oddly enough, I think that both of these are the same problem on some level. Did anyone go to art school? As did I. My general kind of feeling is that one of the things that happens in the structure of art school is you make work, you talk about it with the group. You make work, you talk about it with the group. You continue to do that. Once you've done that for 4 years, you become indoctrinated to the idea that it's necessary to talk about the work with the group. If you're a designer, once you do professional work, that almost never happens. You show the work, you explain what you're trying to do, and then someone who presumably has like a pay grade above you either goes, yes, or hey, have you thought about this, or try this, or do this, or whatever. In my experience, it's much less of a back and forth. They might ask you a question, you answer it, and maybe that sways them. But it's way different than that crazy, intense back and forth of a critique. In a job, you can kind of excuse all of that because you're like, you have to do the work. It's kind of built in. The deadlines are real. But then once you have to do your own work, a lot of people flounder without the structure of feedback. Now, one way to solve that is just ask people, hey, I'm working on this thing. Can I meet you to talk about it? I find that that doesn't really work either. And again, I think it's like there's a lack of fear. Like, if you show up to a class without work, even if everyone is cool, you know that there's like a self-imposed public shaming that comes along with that. When you flake on the client, that kind of stuff happens. But you making work and then just doing it like in this kind of open-ended fashion, but you're trying to make it feel real, it can be really easy to go, you know what, the problem is I'm not getting feedback. I think both of these things are actually wrapped up in process. I think if you get that stuff under control, these things melt away as levels of importance, because a lot of the times you need that timeline to freak yourself out and do work because the steps aren't clearly defined enough to sit down at any given moment and just go, okay, I've got to do this now. So a lot of times it's like, okay, I'm gonna have a first draft done at this point. I think that's kind of like when you miraculously get something done for a client at the last minute, except that without that pressure, most of us won't do that. And I think the feedback thing is kind of similar. Now, I'm not saying that feedback is bad, but I'm saying that in the middle of summer, trying to get your friends to critique your work might not be the easiest thing in the world, because like there's more fun and more important things to do in their life than like providing you with feedback. But the other thing is, if you can get the workflow stuff articulated and under control, you can provide your own feedback, because you can set up the process in a way where you go like, okay, I'm doing this and I'm doing this and I'm doing this. And then I know that at this stage, I'm gonna generate 3 or 5 or 10 options. I'm gonna pick one and I'm just gonna move forward with it. Or I'm gonna put them away for a week. Once I've got to that point, then I'm gonna come back to them, and then I'll decide like what's wrong with them or what's good or what's bad or whatever. But most of this stuff is really about structure. And once you bring that structure into your own work, this stuff dissolves away as being hyper important. It's still always important. And if you can get feedback from people you trust, that's great. But you can make this a non-issue and become a little bit more self-sufficient. The third one, which is a great problem to have, is you have too many ideas and you don't know which one to do first. And it could be that you're just so excited about all these ideas equally that you're just so ramped up. It's like, what do? You start one and you start another, and then you get all excited about something else. What we talk about today, I think, is going to cut through this problem, hopefully, in a way where you can go like, oh, at this point, I need to work on this kind of project. But the other one is to get into that kind of paralysis by analysis, where you think too much about the sort of potential rewards, or what would it be, like losing out if you spend too much time on something and it's not really what you needed to do. If you don't have a goal of some kind defined of like, where am I trying to get to, it's really easy to get stuck in this zone of not knowing what to do next because you haven't figured out what you need to solve. So how do you know what tool you need? It's literally like being in the tool shed with no idea what you're going to do and debating whether it's like, do I need the hammer, the saw, the screwdriver, the wood glue? Well, what are you trying to do? And you're like, I don't know, just want to make something. I mean, if you're that loose about it, hopefully you just pick up two things and then you're done. But most of us don't. We kind of overthink it. So defining a goal is a really easy way to kind of put that at bay, because at the very least, it's like you can always do the 78 projects. You just have to do one of them right now, save the other 77 for later. And then the last one, you have ideas, but you don't work on them. You procrastinate on them. One thing that separates the self-imposed portfolio project from really almost anything else you do is that no matter how boring your job is or how boring your client is, when they come to you with a new project, there's some semblance of adventure involved in that they're giving you a thing to do that you wouldn't have done otherwise. So even if the way that you design is someone goes, we need a poster for X, and 5 minutes later, walking out of the meeting, you're like, doing your calculations, I will do this. You immediately have an answer to it. It kind of becomes like you have to do an errand, but at the very least, the impulse for it has some level of like the unknown in it. School's the same way. Any real project, especially for designers, tends to have a third party. Not always, but like 75% of the time. But when we come up with our own projects, we lose the third party. So if you can imagine that exact same situation, poster for X, I come up with a solution immediately. You define that whole thing on your own. You just took anything resembling adventure out of it. Because you're like, okay, I need to make a portfolio piece. I'm going to make a poster for this, and I'm going to do it like this, which is like kind of the most common thing to procrastinate on, this super clearly defined project. Because like, why do it? Just imagine it and then go do something interesting. It literally becomes like just an errand that you have to do. Like working with students, a lot of times I teach like their last class where they're supposed to define their own project. And shockingly, the thing that people are building up towards for 2 years or 4 years is the thing they're most likely to procrastinate on. And the reason is that there's no adventure. It's literally just a to-do list because they've been thinking about it so long. And it's not until you kind of intervene and go like, look, you can know it's a poster and you can know the content, but if you already decide how you're going to do it, you are very likely not going to do it. You have to become like hyper driven at that point. You have to become the kind of person where fake timelines motivate you. You actually do get people to give you feedback and then you meet those deadlines because you're basically working in spite of yourself. It's like you have this creative project to do, except that you kind of took out the creative part. It might look cool. It might technically challenge you, but that part of your brain that wants to explore whatever's in front of you, you just deprived it of the opportunity to do that. And like, I know for me, like up until a few years ago, this was my biggest problem. And I would try to use this stuff to solve this thing. So I'd be like, I've got this great idea for this thing. I just have to do this, 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 and this, and make it look like this. And I'd make like this to-do list and a calendar, and then I wouldn't touch it. Everything else in my life was more interesting, like cleaning the kitchen or organizing the basement or watching The Wire, which is admittedly more interesting than anything else I do in my life anyway, but that idea is like, if you overly define it, it's really easy to procrastinate on. Those are what I kind of see as the big stumbling blocks. They've definitely been this big stumbling blocks for me, and I've seen it a lot with students. So I've had all the students fill out a questionnaire. What are you doing right now? What do you want to be doing? Like, what's your dream job? If you could snap your fingers and have the situation that you want, what would it be? And then what do you think is missing from your portfolio to make you the kind of natural fit for that dream job? And then lastly, what's currently in your portfolio? And it's funny because it's pretty much a text-based answer. You know, it's like, this project, which is this, and these are the formats. Does anybody freak out when you have to answer that goal question? Nobody did the freaking, I just want to get my foot in the door thing. That's like my biggest pet peeve in the world when people say that. And only a couple of you said, I want to do everything, which is fine, actually. I admire wanting to do everything. What we're going to do is, I'm going to ask you those same questions in front of everybody so that we're on the same page. So we're going to talk probably about 2 projects per person. One of the things I like is that because you had to just describe the portfolio, everything becomes very universal, because we're not going to sit there and be like, oh, the leading or blah, 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 or like, you know, have you thought about green? But instead that we get to talk about this idea of like, how do you take this thing and make it fuller and more rich, which then becomes of value to everyone in the room, which I think is cool, or that's how it should work. So as we're gonna get into watching these actual one-on-one kind of consultations, before each one, I'm just gonna give you the lowdown of what that person said in their questionnaire. So, number 1, and I don't have names, I should have given them names, but I don't, but you'll figure it out. What are you doing now? I work as a communication specialist at a university in one of their research institutes. Work is about 30% design, 70% other things. I started out of college as a designer with agencies, but quickly moved to nonprofit work and picked up additional communication skills. What do you want to be doing? Dream situation. I love this. Marry rich, work as a freelance illustrator and screen printer, have my own little studio, and only work when I want to. That is my honest answer. The dream. What do you think is missing from your portfolio? More illustration work. I have some now. I'm building that up slowly, but the majority of my portfolio is design work right now. And then lastly, what's in your portfolio? 1, nonprofit work collateral, so newsletters, brochures, direct mailers. 2, solar opportunity series, branding and design work for an event series for a nonprofit. 3, Minnesota Beetle project, design work done at an agency to promote an album release. 4, infographics. 5, 3 different branding projects. 6, illustration projects. 7, screen prints. Let's get into that. Okay, so there's a couple things. 1, what's the nature of the illustration that you want to do? Do you want to have a thing or a style and be known for it, or a handful of styles? Or do you want to be one of these illustrators that's more graphic designy? If you think about the New York Times editorial page, a lot of those illustrators have a graphic design background, and one of the things that happens from that is they don't have a style, they have a kind of problem-solving approach. It's not 100%, but it's true for a lot of those types of people. If that's not what you want to do, then that changes things. The next thing I'd want to know is like, okay, these people who hire you to do illustrations, what are they hiring you to do? Typically, what are you making the illustrations for? Are you making illustrations for product that might be almost more like capsule collections? And then there's another idea, which is like, do you want to be an illustrator, or do you want to have a design studio that's heavily based doing illustration. Something in there is going to help us figure out what stuff to leverage and what stuff to kill. If the goal is to get illustration work that is basically pictorial and not problem solving, like you are thinking, oh yeah, we want such and such, their style would be great for this, then the focus would be on making more work in that style. Okay, this illustration is cool, but it doesn't look like the other stuff, and there's just one of them. If there's just one, my argument is integrate it into another project, and the illustration is a value add or a plus one. The idea kind of being like, I designed this thing and I did this killer illustration. But if the illustration's the hero and making pictures is the goal, then I would say, okay, can you expand this into a series? But if the goal is to be known for making pictures, then I would be taking those illustrations and figuring out thematically how to stretch them. Like, I looked at someone's portfolio recently, and they had this killer geometric illustration of some kind of animal. And my feeling was, if you got one of these, it's cool, but it's really random and it's not a portfolio piece. It's like a nice little connective tissue between projects. Like, hey, look what else I do. But if you have a series of animal illustrations in this style, that's a project. Or if you have a series of illustrations in that style, you take that thing, you find how to turn it into a project. I would start asking probably the same questions about the screen prints. Like, what kind of content is in the screen prints? Can that get blown out of these are screen prints into this is a body of work? Some of it happens to be screen printed.
So I think a couple of questions I would ask is like, is there, in terms of having just a portfolio that goes in that direction that you want to go to, like, is there stuff you can extract that you can actually decontextualize to make the illustration the main part of the story? So like what you described, like, I feel like when I think infographics, I think like graphic designer who wants to do infographics, which isn't a thing that you said. But one of the things I wonder about is there stuff in those infographics that you could pull out and isolate and make the illustration the star of the story?
Yes.
So that would be one thing I would propose doing. Instead of it being about an infographic, it's about pictures. And that can be as simple as like even within a portfolio to flip the importance. So like what would a graphic designer do with an infographic? Show the whole thing, then show details. I would be like, can you flip that to where it's all about the illustrations? And then, oh, by the way, here's the whole thing in context. So that when someone looks at it, what they're thinking about is, this is an illustrator. Because like having a poster is great, but then knowing that you're trying to develop a style, if that thing is pointing in the right direction of that style, is there a way to like take that one poster and turn it into 3 in some way? And it's harder with illustration because there's more labor involved. But on the other hand, if you've put the effort into developing the style, then making the pictures might not be that labor intensive. That would be a thing I would think about, is like, is there stuff that's one thing that you can make a series and then help to kind of like beef up that idea of I'm an illustrator. And then the other thing is I would start stealing as much of your illustration work out of your design projects as possible. You could even have 2 portfolios, right? Like you have a design portfolio because you need to make money, but you have a separate portfolio that's entirely about the illustrations, and the design is just like, it's a nice thing that's in the background. Normally, like what designers do is like, you have a bunch of work that has illustration in it, or photography, let's say. The thing that happens is it's all about the design, but the photography is like a nice like +1 to whatever that project is. And it's like, oh shit, you did the photography too, or oh shit, you did those illustrations. It's like this thing you add on to it. So I would advocate you flip that, and instead you make it about the illustrations, and the like, oh shit, you designed it as well. Like, let that be the +1 and just kind of like inverse the normal thing that graphic designers do. My hope is that by the time we get to the end, whoever's last, we actually don't have to talk about anything. Because you'll be like, oh yeah, I heard like this, this, and this, I'm done. Okay, participant number 2. What are you doing now? Freelance graphic design, sound design, and music composition. This person's also a substitute teacher. What do you want to be doing? Full-time freelance in my creative endeavors. Would love to phase out needing to substitute teach. Would consider agency or corporate work if I was a good fit, but it's never worked out in the past. For the graphic design side of things, I love working on logos, web design, print, motion, graphics, and social media. For music and sound design, I like creating for animation, motion graphics, etc. What do you think is missing from your portfolio? I think my biggest problem is I'm not sure what's missing. I have a feeling I need more actual big jobs to showcase. I'd like to focus more on digital design. I have some current jobs that I plan on putting in once they're finished, but for now I think I'm lacking in that category. I worry I may also have too much content. And then lastly, what's in your portfolio? Branding package for a realtor, logo and web design for a little consulting thing, animation and music for a choir, jersey design for a bike club, music and sound design for a video, CD packaging design, some music composition, so on and so forth. I think this one is really interesting because this guy suffers from, not even suffers from, but he is a jack of all trades, quite literally. And I don't think that that's a bad thing, but I think it requires some smart conversation to figure out how to make it work. So a big chunk of this is on how do you tell your own story. Okay, so the ideal thing would be to freelance, and the other thing would be like, oh, if it worked out, that would be nice, but it's not like you want to redirect your portfolio towards working at an agency. Okay, cool. A general thing I would throw out on that is the idea of whether it looks like you're running these separate businesses or whether you're like an individual creative with like bodies of work, like almost like the idea of authorship. And I was thinking about like, I'm trying to think of an example that's weird. I was like looking at someone's website and they're like a fairly well-known musician who's also a graphic designer, and it was a little bit strange. Like it was just like, why isn't the graphic design in its own world? It didn't feel like it gelled in a way that was cohesive. But then if I think about, what's his name? Trevor Jackson, who is famous DJ and producer and graphic designer, like is at the level where other famous graphic designers have been his interns, like in the UK. But when you go to his website, it's presented as if like, I'm Trevor Jackson and here's this crazy body of work. And I think what comes across is like Trevor Jackson, not I've got a graphic design business and a record label and I can DJ your shows and blah, 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 you know what I mean? And I think a part of that is just that framing and like in how they relate. The other thing is he's a graphic designer who pretty much mostly has only done music packaging. It fits very well within this website that's already there. So that's just some stuff to think about. One thing that you said here was that you felt like you needed more big jobs to showcase. If you decide you want to go into agencies, like you need those expansive projects because they operate in an expansive, almost non-reality based world. Obviously they have to make stuff and it needs to be real, but the amount of stuff that has to go into a typical like execution can be so wide ranging and all over the place that they want to make sure that you talk their language, like that you understand like that idea of imagining all the different ways that something could play out. And so that's kind of what I latched onto. So some stuff that stood out to me. And so this is one thing kind of for everybody to think about is like a lot of times you have these cool little projects that are real, but they're super little. The thing to remember is that like the real projects, what is great about them is they demonstrate that you have actually done something and you know how to do it. So whether it's a web development project or even just like modifying a Squarespace site, like that stuff is important because you're like, I can do this for you and I know how to do it. But the problem with like those projects is they're entirely based in reality. And reality for our like little clients is boring as shit and not exciting to anyone. Like, unless you're the most amazing like visual designer, reality can be like a very kind of boring place to be operating. So one of the things to think about is like, just because you only did X for someone, because that was the job. So it's like a little branding project, and you make like a logo, and it's a nice logo, and maybe you like made some patterns that they're never going to use because they don't make the kind of stuff that fits it, and then you made a couple of things that they do actually use. And in reality, it's fairly boring, just because of the scale. There's no reason why you can't cover off on that stuff and then go, what if this client had a budget and ambition? What would I do for them? And then blow that stuff out. And I think that's one of those low-hanging fruit things, is if you did good work, but it's by its very nature compromised by the scale, just get rid of the idea that it needs to be compromised by that scale. You can literally have it be set up in your portfolio, like on your website, that the first chunk is the like reality, like it's the concept behind it. Here's the reality of what this client can afford. Here's what I propose as like the way this should be done, if that makes sense. Like, you don't have to be handcuffed by what someone actually did or how much money they actually had. Just off that alone, you have like this realtor. Now, for all I know, she's like the greatest, most ambitious realtor with gigantic budgets. The thing that I wonder about there is, it sounds like a kind of standard package, and it's probably governed by realistic budgets. Like, you can do motion graphics, but then like how much can you do?
Oh, I did that for free.
There you go.
I wanted to put it in my portfolio.
Okay, so you're already on the right track.
Yeah.
So then one thing is like, with this, like, can you just list out all the public facing stuff she could do,
Sure.
and then expand it to that? And who knows, your clients could be like, oh, I hadn't even thought about that, and maybe they get super excited. But at the very least, when you're talking to someone who has like a bigger branding project, or to a design agency, because like they do cool stuff and you want to work there, that they see like the level of ambition that matches the demands of what they do. I would think about. The other one that I was wondering about is like, you have the rainy day choir, animation and music composition.
That was just that.
So my thing would be to look at that and again, like, okay, like I did this animation for this purpose. If this was a bigger client, what would the other things that they need that animation to work for, and how would I build that up? So it's like, would I need like the 5-second YouTube pre-roll type thing? Do I reformat it for an Instagram story versus like a proper post? I'm sure there's more stuff that I'm not thinking about, but like, let's just say for the sake of argument, you're thinking about a Facebook user, and the fact that if there's not something that spells out in language what they need to do, they're not going to unmute that video. So then you go like, okay, well, I can actually add some text to this in a kind of artful or elegant way, and now I've reformatted this in a way that matches the realities of the market. Like, animation is, it's not the rarest skill in the world, but it's certainly more valuable to most people than like a logo. Because like every single person in the world does logos, and like 3 coffee shops in St. Paul have the same logo from the FedEx store. So like, it's a commodity kind of expertise. It's not to say it's not important. Whereas like animation still has somewhat of a degree of like rarity or exclusivity. So that seems like a way to take stuff you've already done and then stretch it out a bit to where it's like, you almost really don't have to do anything. Like, you kind of do, because you have to like think about like, well, how would I show this? But you can stretch that out to where like, now it's not an animation, now it's a campaign. Mm-hmm. And the thing to think about, and this kind of like, this runs for whatever we're talking about, is we don't want to do the thing where we're fake making a project look bigger by slapping the exact same thing into a bunch of different formats. Like, you don't want to take an animation that was originally made for like whatever YouTube and then be like, all right, cool. I scaled it down and added a caption, and now it goes in an Instagram story. And then I cut out a minute of it, and now it's an Instagram post, and blah, blah, blah. But instead to be like, okay, how can I adjust the actual content here to where it works at the kind of maximum level for that format? And then the other thing I would think about is the role of context. You don't want to go to a page that's basically 7 different aspect ratios of a video, right? That would be super boring. But if the very first one is the YouTube video, and then the second one is how it works in an Instagram story, but I'm seeing it on a phone as a thing, like in context, and then it's like, here's how it works as a Facebook video, it becomes less about the video and more about telling the story of how you approach those things differently. Those were 2 things that kind of stood out to me, knowing that yours kind of says, like, literally, I like graphic design. Like, I like doing everything. So those stood out as like kind of the low-hanging fruit to me in terms of like that expansion. Yeah. I think like if you like doing everything, then do everything. I mean, you may want to
everything, but like,
I mean, you have logos, web design, print, motion graphics, social media. I don't think there's anything else left. So,
so jack of all trades, master of none.
I guess you didn't say book design, but you might have meant that by
No,
print.
not doing.
But the thing is, there's nothing wrong with that, but you might want to think about like the context or scale of how you want to approach it, or whether you want to really analyze whether you have an approach or a style, like a way of coming at things so that there is something specific to hang your hat on. Because like otherwise, like graphic designers who want to do everything, that's like 75% of freelance graphic designers. It just makes it that much harder to stand out. And then our last one for this particular chunk of videos, there's going to be probably 2 more of these, and they're really all over the board. So definitely subscribe so that you know when they come out. Okay, so number 3, what are you doing now? Strategist at a social media agency. Not in design, but a lot of my role requires me to use design. What do you want to be doing? I want to freelance with natural skincare brands. What do you think is missing from your portfolio? Examples of the work in the field I want to work in, proof that I can do design other than just put decks together. And then lastly, what's in your portfolio? Most of my current work is designed for strategies and design made for social media. I have 1 freelance branding project in my portfolio. I created a logo, website, mailer, and experiential design for an event. So there's a thing, right? Oh, that's the description of that freelance branding project. So this is another good one where someone has a lot of experience, but not a lot of tangible results. And also they're trying to segue from the thing they're doing now to something totally different. And we get into what's a painless way to do that. So check that out. You had said, I want to freelance and work with natural skincare brands.
So yeah.
You're coming off more as like an author or content creator than a designer.
Right.
Okay. I think you have like a completely different problem, which is that like ultimately you have experience, but you don't actually have a portfolio. Right. If you make a portfolio of the stuff you've made thus far, you will get more of that stuff, which is not the situation that you want. You have to start from scratch, which isn't terrible, but then you run into all of those kinds of problems. The reality is that all of that can very well be like simply a problem both of like the definition of like, okay, like this is the thing I want to do. So one, I have to commit towards that. But then the other part of it is that kind of process thing. Because like knowing what to do and knowing how to do it and then how to be motivated to do it, it's really not about, or I don't think it is. Like I don't think it's about motivation. I think there's like some block that stops you from going like, all right, well I want to do natural skincare. So what would be the obvious thing to do? Find a brand you like with crappy stuff and remake it for your portfolio, which has probably occurred to you, which is nice because that's a very simple thing to solve is you go like, okay, well, why haven't I done that? I think like that's 100% the thing that you have to do. And ultimately what it comes down to is like, you know, without knowing you, all I know is like, you have a portfolio based on the stuff you've done at your job. You don't have a portfolio based on the stuff you want to be doing. and you're not making the stuff that you really want to be doing. So I just always interpret that as somewhere in there, there's an idea in your head that is fucking you up basically and keeps you from doing that thing that you need to be doing. And that if you can figure out what that is, you basically can like flip a switch to where it's very easy to do those personal projects that you need to do. But you do not want to do anything I'm talking about like to anybody else, because you don't want to expand these projects. Like you want to, like these projects need to be in the rear view and not be thinking about them. And instead you just want to be like, cool, I got the experience and I got the good thinking that comes from working in like a strategic social media agency. That's super valuable. The whole thing though is you just don't want to do that so long that 14 years from now, cool, you know so much about like whatever strategy and reaching consumers and blah, 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 but that whole entire time you didn't develop the like one skill that kind of mattered to you. So don't worry about like the expansion, like just assume you're starting from scratch, and then you need to embrace that so that it's the easiest thing in the world to do. And it could just be that you create a brand too, and that's a way of handling it, but you do something along those lines, and then you do it like 4 times, and then you start approaching brands to get work. Well, one, if you take that and you couple it with the social media strategy stuff, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, this person gets what we do, and they know how to do stuff that we don't know how to do, and then like all of a sudden that's value. And I would say this kind of goes across the board. You'd never want to have to convince someone that you know how to do the thing that they need to be done. Like what you want is to be the obvious answer to someone's problem far and away. Like you almost want it to be like your personality could be terrible, you could be late, a bus could have splashed dirty water all over you, and someone else could have spilled coffee on you on the way to that interview. But like what they see in that portfolio is like, oh, this person is like solves our problems. 6 out of the 10 projects in here relate to the kind of stuff that we do, and the other 4 projects show that they're not obsessed with only one thing. Like they show them as like well-rounded, but specifically we know there's 6 packaging projects or 6 beauty advertising projects or whatever it is. And I'm not saying you should wait till you have 6, but you want at least probably 4, unless like your personality is so off the charts that like you can show 2 projects and people are like, all right, check. But that's a gamble, so I don't know if I advocate that. So like you want to get out of healthcare or mostly out of healthcare? Okay, so you want to like kind of a jobby job. All right, I got some questions then. How long have you been? Okay, is it at this point in time is like kind of the bulk of your design portfolio stuff from there? Okay, does it all look the same? No, like there's variety in it?
There's actually quite a bit of variety.
That's cool.